Today, tomorrow, I mean, those days feel pretty good. So I'm actually hoping that and then there'll be another heat spell. Yeah, at least one more week of it, but I'm hoping it sort of gets kind of nice and yeah, yeah. Yeah, see, yeah, because you can, I mean, it'll be nice enough to have a fire in the morning and the night. Well, good morning. Good morning. Can y'all hear me? No? Yeah, so I'll turn it back up here in a second because when we show the video, it actually comes in and it's louder. So after the video, it'll sound better. Well, good morning, and those that are joining us from home, good morning to you. And we'll begin in probably a minute or two. Should be a prayer pad going around at some point. And then at the same time, Betty Hips will collect what we do here, but then those that send prayer requests electronically, she'll email those out. So if you're not receiving those, email Betty. And if you need Betty's email, Kathy can give it to you. And that'll sort of maybe keep us all in the loop. We're pretty good. I looked at this morning on the refreshment list. I think we're good basically to about December. So about maybe next week or so, we'll send it back around just to make sure everybody knows if there are dates coming up. Announcements. You might have heard Ed Poole passed away yesterday. Yesterday afternoon, and Carolyn is meeting with the funeral home this morning, actually here in about a little bit, an hour, and we'll hope to be able to send out dates for service, things like we're hoping, or maybe thinking tentatively like a Friday morning service, but we'll verify all of that later this afternoon. Sure. Yeah, so you can see that I tried that. The black does not work. For whatever reason, it doesn't. You can tell a big difference just in, and that's a brand new marker. So it could be the marker, who knows. So, no, I'm tried to find the darkest one I had, and so, but we'll keep at it till we get another black one. And this is probably too much. It's probably overkill. More than anything else, because a lot of this is reminders for me not to forget something, and so, but yeah, so I'll do my best on that. But I did. Black actually is the best, but for whatever reason, our black markers are not working well. So I know we've got some. I'll just keep. I mean, I'll just my black markers. Let me rephrase. Every year I get Kathy to order me about 20 of them. And for whatever reason, the black one is not working. So, and it could be that just it's this part of the board. I didn't try it on all that. So, but we'll make the adjustment. All right. Anything else? Any other announcements that we need to mention? All right. Well, we'll pray in just a second. We'll shut the doors. All right, well, let's pray, and then we'll begin. Oh, God, for today, we're grateful for your grace and your mercy, and what we pray, Lord, is in this time of study and reflection and fellowship, we want you to be a part of all of this, so collectively be with us at the same time on an individual level. If there's something that is either mentioned or discussed, then that becomes a spark that through the role of your Spirit, ends up with levels of faith development inside of us, then, oh God, that's our prayer. And then ultimately, we want it to end or manifest itself in our life so that it's not just something that we believe or know, it becomes something that we live. And so, as always, we're open for this, and we pray for this, and we pray this in your name. Amen. So I mentioned this battle last year, and so what we have in the book of Daniel is you have the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and up until then, so if you think, I don't know if I think I passed out a sheet last week that just talks on the far right-hand corner of that sheet. It gives you the different powers, and you have before the Babylonian. I mean, you have the Egyptians, and then you have the Assyrians, and eventually they'll give way to the Babylonians, and the major battle that sort of ends the Egyptians and the Assyrians' reign, and it puts the Babylonians on their front foot, is this battle at Carchemish. And I found this video that just talks about it, at least for a little bit, and it'll just give you some insight historically about what's going on, because right after this battle in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, who is not the ruler of the Babylonian Empire, or at this time it's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he's their major general. His dad is actually on the throne. But Nebuchadnezzar is the chief general, and he overwhelmingly defeats the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and actually the southern kingdom of Judah is also linked in with the Egyptians and the Assyrians. But he soundly defeats them, and it paves the way for Nebuchadnezzar to head south. So he comes out of Syria down through Lebanon and overtakes Jerusalem. And even though it doesn't mention it in the text here, because the first 3 or 4 verses of the book of Daniel is just a summary of all of this. It doesn't mention the battle, but it just basically mentions in the reign of Jehoiakim. But this is all the stuff that's going on just a few years before the book of Daniel begins. But it gives insight into, it sort of gives us some historical information and some insight into what took place just before Daniel. Daniel would have been maybe 11, 12, 13 at this time. We do know that he is deported around 14, 15. But anyway, I found this video, and this will give you some historical information. We also sent out the link that Joanne mentioned. I think it's the Bible Project. I don't know if you saw that. It's about a little 8-minute video. Yeah. So if you want any of those little quick thumbnail sketches, they do every book of the Bible. And so, I mean, it's actually pretty good. So, so well done to whoever's the architect behind that. But that's helpful. And if you didn't receive those last week, just let me know after the class, and we can send it to you. All right. So Teresa, I'm about to show it.
The Battle of Carchemish was fought about 605 BC between the allied armies of Egypt and former Assyria against Babylonia. Background: when the Assyrian capital Nineveh was overrun by the Babylonians in 612 BC, the Assyrians moved their capital to Haran. When Haran was captured by the Babylonians in 610 BC, the capital was once again moved, this time to Carchemish, on the Euphrates River. Egypt was allied with the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit II, and marched in 609 BC to his aid against the Babylonians. The Egyptian army of Pharaoh Necho II was delayed at Megiddo by the forces of King Josiah of Judah. Josiah was killed and his army was defeated. The dead body of Josiah was delivered to Jerusalem immediately and buried according to the customs of Judah's kings, near the grave of King David. The Egyptians and Assyrians together crossed the Euphrates and laid siege to Haran, which they failed to retake. They then retreated to northern Syria. Battle. The Egyptians met the full might of the Babylonian army led by Nebuchadnezzar II at Carchemish, where the combined Egyptian and Assyrian forces were soundly destroyed. Assyria ceased to exist as an independent power, and Egypt retreated and was no longer a significant force in the ancient Near East. Babylonia reached its economic peak after 605 BC. Records of the battle. The Nebuchadnezzar Chronicle, now housed in the British Museum, claims that Nebuchadnezzar crossed the river to go against the Egyptian army which lay in Carchemish. They fought with each other and the Egyptian army withdrew before him. He accomplished their defeat and beat them to non-existence. As for the rest of the Egyptian army which had escaped from the defeat so quickly that no weapon had reached them, in the district of Hamath the Babylonian troops overtook and defeated them so that not a single man escaped to his own country. At that time Nebuchadnezzar conquered the whole area of Hamath. The battle is also mentioned and described in the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah and 2 Chronicles.
Give you just some insight. All right. Do you like that computer voice? Battle. But what makes that significant is that the Assyrians are the ones that wiped out the 10 tribes of Israel in the north about 150 years before. So for the better part of a couple of hundred years, if not more, the Assyrians were the major players, at least dominant, and they were not a nice people, and very, very. They were just vicious and very hard on the people that they captured. The Babylonians are similar, but the Babylonians definitely value education. At that time, they had the largest library. They were cultured compared to their time period, and but also a major powerhouse. So all of that was taking place in 605, and what most historians, and there's some archaeological evidence to back this up, about 8 to 9 months later, Nebuchadnezzar takes Jerusalem. And so this is last week when we talked about where there were all these kings, sort of one right after the other of the southern king. The tribe of Judah is still in existence. There is some deportation that takes place. Obviously, Daniel and a number of others are deported, but they're not wiped out, as in totally annihilated, for maybe about another 10 years. So this is the very beginning of Daniel in his life in Babylon. So hope that's helpful. It might just kind of give you something if you have a study Bible, or if you catch something in some other studies outside of the book of Daniel. It might mention some of these things. I just wanted you to be aware of it. So, anyways, all right, so let's begin. So if somebody would read for us Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, that would be good.
In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylon, and put in the treasure house of his God. How many do you want me to read?
Down to 7, if you would.
Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court of officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name of Belteshazzar; to Hannibal, Shadrach; to Meshach, and to Azrael, Abednego.
All right, thank you. She's got them all right. Yeah, there we go. Good job. Yep. So from then on, it's all downhill. I just want you to know. Um, so some of the things that we see in this passage that is noteworthy. So again, it's on the heels or right after the battle where pretty much now Babylon is the chief power, or at least they're on their front foot. Nebuchadnezzar is not the emperor yet. He's going to be, because his father's going to die not long into this. Even though it doesn't mention that Jerusalem is taken, it's implied. And so we do have some insight there. Jeremiah 46 is, if you want to find some biblical reference to that, Jeremiah 46 is where he talks about this. There's a couple things that's noteworthy. Remember, the major theme of the book of Daniel is the sovereignty of God. And so we'll see things that show up often where Daniel describes this, particularly this idea that in verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. So you see where Daniel is attributing all this that's going on what for him would be the world stage, all at the hand of God. And this is going to be, you're going to see this over and over and over in the passage. You'll see where it says, and the Lord gave, or the Lord did this. So just sort of be on the lookout. The sovereignty of God is, the overarching theme of the book of Daniel. The word there for Lord that is used is Adonai. It's not Jehovah. And Adonai actually means like ruler, owner, sovereign. So you can see Daniel, even the word that he used for God is the one that attributes sovereignty. And that'll be significant because the sovereignty of God is the dominant theme. I think the versions say either gave or delivered. In verse 2, it says the Lord delivered or the Lord gave. The literal word there is gave, and it's to emphasize not so much Nebuchadnezzar's military might or his tactical brilliance as much as that it's all at the hand of God. So that's now what's interesting is years ago, and I think it's in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, where Hezekiah is the king, for whatever reason, and we don't know why, but there was maybe some envoys from Babylon that came to Judea, and Hezekiah basically showed him all the gold that was in the temple, which was a bonehead move, if you think about it. Because then he goes back, and a few decades later, guess what? Here come the here come the Babylonians. But you get reference to that because what they take, and this is in verse 2. It says, "The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands with some of the vessels of the house of God." So basically, they go back and say, "Hey, these guys got a lot of money over here," and so that's one of the things they do is they ransack part of the temple, and they take the gold and some of the valuable things back, and they put it into basically their vault or their house of worship. But for those historians and who will also read the Bible and look for biblical references, if you ever read their stuff, it's like, why on earth would Hezekiah do that? But he did. I think it's Isaiah 39. Yeah, I got it in my notes, Isaiah 39. And then there's something else that's really interesting in the passage. So if you look back at verse 2, and Daniel does this throughout the whole book, so this is interesting. Whenever he makes reference to Adonai, he always puts the prefix the God. And he doesn't do that whenever there's references to Babylonian deity, because there'll be some of that shows up. But like in verse 2, it actually says, he actually uses an article and where it says the vessels of the house of, and of course in English it just says God, but in the Hebrew it actually says the vessels of the house of the God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, the house of his God. And so again, this is just some things that when we read the passage and we look at what Daniel is doing, I mean, it's interesting. The word that he used for God is important. How he sets that off compared to whenever he makes references to the Babylonian gods, it's completely different. So I mean, just for those that read Hebrew, which I don't, but I know just a few words in Hebrews to be able to not even do anything, but nonetheless, this is what happens, and so that's good. It's interesting that he does that. So so they basically, and then they deport. They're mentioned four. You got Daniel, you've got Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. There are four mentioned, but there are others that would have been deported. It's not just those four. And I think it says among them in verse, verse 6 says among these or among them or something along those lines. These are the ones that are highlighted, obviously, because they're also going to be the ones that are talked about in the coming chapters. But there were others. And what Babylon would do, it's not just that they do this with people from Judah. Whenever they conquered a group, they would take the best and brightest young men, 13, 14, 15 years old, and they would deport them, and they would put them into a 3-year really indoctrination program. And at the end of 3 years, they would have, and we're going to get into this at the remaining parts of chapter 1, they have a 3-year study period. At the end of that study period, they would then basically be tested. And however they performed on the test would determine what government job they received, or if they even lived. And so it's interesting. This is not just Daniel and his three buddies. It's a number of them that they would all go through that level of indoctrination, and it was other people in the empire, not just the Hebrews. So you have these court officials. I think some Bibles say eunuchs. Eunuchs is often a word that is used as a court official, maybe like a middle management type person. It's the same word that's used for Potiphar. If you were to go back and read in the book of Genesis, Potiphar has that same word. It's the Hebrew word saris, and that could be a literal eunuch, or it could stand for a designated official for the king or some ruler, whatever it may be. But there is this one court official. He is mentioned. At least we know him by name, and his name is.
Is that in 7?
Chief eunuchs. Yep. So that's. Yeah, where's that at? What verse is that? Verse 3. Yeah. So, yep. All right. So we do have this guy, Ashpenaz, and he's over at least some level of the indoctrination type process. Now what we don't know is he assigned to all of them, or is he just assigned to a few folks? But what we do know is Daniel and his buddies were assigned to him, or vice versa, and he's responsible for them, which will be interesting. And the reason why I point this out is because when we move into the second part of this of chapter 1, this guy takes a risk. So it's not just Daniel taking a risk when they have issues around food, but this guy has to, he's taking a risk because if his group of people or young students, if they all fail the test, well, it's not just a reflection upon the students. Now it's also a reflection on the keeper or the instructor. What we do believe, or at least what most people believe, is that Daniel and the three, they are part of the ruling class of Judah. Maybe related, maybe part of most people believe that Daniel's part of Zedekiah's line or lineage, so some level of royalty, and probably the other three in some form or fashion. And so these are people that are not just any person. These would have been people that would have been groomed in Judah to have some level of leadership, or maybe even be king or ruler down the road. But teenage boys coming from families of high social standings, and the reason why Babylon would do this is that, one, it would ensure the best and brightest that would be in their kingdom or in their leadership, but if it's also depleting the leadership of the people that they conquered. We're in football season, so it's taking all the 5-star recruits, so that you're left with a lot of yeah, exactly right. So a lot of Alabama and Georgia nowadays, so that now they're left with Auburn. So 3-star, 2-star, and and things like that. So it's not too far from the SEC. Do what? What's that? Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So or A&M or Florida, they're the ones that are taking it on the chin, it seems. So, so this was sort of the MO for Babylon, and so this is not just it's not just highlighting Daniel and the three. If we were to read Babylonian accounts, there would be other areas that they've conquered and people that they deported from there. But verse 4, the education of young Persians, that would begin on their 14th birthday or their 14th year. And so you can see why they chose Daniel and the other three about the same time. There's some qualifications that they were looking for in these people, and what are they? Have to be, good physical health. Have to be pretty. I'm not sure pretty is the word that... handsome, how about that? Yeah, so... so they have to have physically, they have to be in good health, some level of attraction. What else? Yeah, they have to be intelligent. Sensible. So does any of your versions of your Bible have like prudent or having insight or comprehension? What's that, Pam? Yeah, discernment, same thing. Yeah, so good. Those are pretty good translations. But this is not your average person. So this is someone that if they had standardized tests, they're testing on the high level, physically in good shape, best and brightest, and because they're going to serve the king. That's the end place for them. They're going to serve in the king's palace. The literal phrase there is those who have power to stand in the palace before the king. And whenever it says stand before the king, that's sort of an idiom for serving the king. But what we find in this passage, at least the qualifications, there's some level of power, some level of ability, because they at some point are going to have some official duty or some type of job in the Babylonian wheel. And so it's not just the average folk. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is, why do they not train their own people? And that's a good question. We don't know 100% why. So the Babylonian 14-year-olds that had skills as well, they would be in this process as well. But by taking in other people, you lessen your opposition, and the indoctrination. And when the Babylonians took over a place, eventually they would plow it up quite nicely. When Nebuchadnezzar gets just tired of the thorn that Jerusalem is, he flattens the entire city. And so what's left is what's left is just a remnant. So to demoralize your opponents. If you take their best and brightest. And the 3-year period of time, they had to learn Akkadian. That's the language. So they had to be able to learn to read and write that. They would be educated in Babylonian lore and things of that nature. They would also have to learn other languages. And they would know that their hometown pretty much is gone. And at the end of the 3 years, their livelihood would be dependent upon how, whether or not they could get along in the program. And so it's not just that if you failed the test, you get the backseat job. If some of them didn't make it out of the program, they died, they got killed. So it had a lot of incentive to sort of jump in and let's own the Babylonian way. So knowing that makes Daniel's and their stance that much more it's a pretty interesting thing that Daniel does when it comes to, let me see if we can do it our own way in light of the larger picture of what's going on with us. And that's what we're going to get into here in a second. But it's not just these foreign people. It would have been homegrown Babylonians as well. Yes, that's just another word that's used for Babylonians. Yeah, so the Chaldeans is a word that is used. You might find that in some of your versions, and that's okay. It's just the Hebrew word for Babylonians is Chaldeans or Chaldeans, and so it's like 6 in one, half dozen the other. And some versions will lean on that, and others won't.
One thing that I was thinking too is that part of this and being God's story is that it keeps the remnant, it keeps the line pure, where part of what the Babylonians wanted to do is intermarry into their culture.
Yeah.
But him staying separate left that remnant that could come back for.
Right. Yeah. So the question or the comment is about if Daniel and some of the others stay, to use the word pure in their Jewish faith or Hebrew life, then it sort of keeps that remnant alive. And there is some of that. Daniel never makes it back. So Daniel dies in Babylon. Now he's there for like 80, 90 years. And so he's there throughout pretty much the whole reign and rise and eventual fall of Babylon. And then the Persians come in next. And that's where you have Xerxes. That might be the main ruler there. And then, of course, after the Persians, you get the Greeks. And then from the Greeks, you get the Romans. But there is some of that, yeah. And but it's which puts all this in play and it shows you that the request of Daniel to be a part of the program, but then at the same time to do it differently, that's a pretty bold move, and it's not something that is, hey, just I don't want to, I want to have a vegan diet or something like that. It's completely different, because part of this indoctrinational program that they're now a part of is not just the education, but accommodations, food. They're given everything that a group of people would need in order to excel. And to eat from the king's table means to eat the same food as the king. That's a pretty high honor. And they were to be well trained. They to have all the advantages that would, at least for 3 years, that Babylon could give to them, but they wanted a yield, and that would be eventually that they're in the ruling party, or they're part of the deal. And the names changes. Now, how are we to interpret that the names changed? Is that, is this, are they sticking it to Daniel and his friends? Is this to be punitive, or is it just they're now in a foreign country, and you're going to have to learn foreign names?
Well, the third one is Mishael.
Right.
That's referring to God.
Yeah, so the names...
Not like the names that they were given in the meaning.
Yeah, so Daniel's name actually means, the Hebrew name Daniel means God is my judge. And then Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious. Mishael means who is or what is God. Or there's no other God like Israel, the God of Israel. Azrael, Azariah means Yahweh has helped or will help. So these are all, when we first meet them, we see their Hebrew names, and they're all tied to Judaism. And the new names obviously are completely different. And they're similar, but now instead of being tied to something of Old Testament, it's tied to Babylonian life. And that's not, what most people, at least what most scholars believe, is that everybody would have received a Babylonian name. So all the 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds that were deported, they would have received a name that would be indigenous to the place that they now reside. So it's not trying to degrade or humiliate. It's just, guess what? You got to learn the Babylonian way. So they're all given new names. Joseph, for instance, in Genesis, when Joseph is rising through the ranks in Pharaoh's, in his deal, he's given an Egyptian name. So that was common. It's not just Babylon that does this. There were others. Esther, she's given a different name. So, this is not the only ones. Even in the New Testament, in the Greek, whose name changes? One of the disciples, Saul and Paul. Who else? Peter. Yeah. So it's fairly common. It's not something that where it's to degrade. It's just they now are in a different place and they, have to learn they learn a different name. When I was in seminary, most of the foreign, we had a number of students from Japan and from China, and most of the Chinese students would take on an American name, and some of that was to just help these poor Southerners who barely understand English, much less Chinese, and so it was always a biblical name, like Mark or John or Peter or something like that, but so that's fairly common. If there was a hand or something, okay.
Well, I thought it was interesting. There's a note down here where it says they were taught the Chaldean language, and this says the language was Aramaic. And I if the Jews brought the Aramaic.
No, that's actually not right. So not to say. Yeah, so Akkadian is more of the language that was spoken in Babylon. They also had to learn, if they didn't know it, so this is not just Daniel and the other folks that were deported, they would have to learn Hebrew, they would have to learn Aramaic, and eventually they would learn Persian. But the language that is tied to Babylon is Akkadian, and the writing is cuneiform, and it's a lot of the wedges. It's not like a typical. And you can see if you go to Britain, and I think it might be in the British Museum, they have a catalog of Babylonian literature, and so this stuff is in here. But it's the language is like this. It's like just cuts and it's not hieroglyphics, but it's definitely not it's not Hebrew. Yeah, it's exactly what it is. So it's interesting.
Akkadian be related to the Akkadian
Say again.
in Canada? Would that Akkadian be related to that Akkadian?
I don't know about. I don't know the second part of your reference, so I can't say yes or no or that. In Canada.
They were the French Canadians that settled in Louisiana.
Yeah, I do know that, but I'm not sure. You're looking at thousands of years of separation. So, yeah, so.
But it's just the same word.
But it could be. These were people that would be. We're talking about Iraq. That's the area. And so, what happens? So when the Persians come in, they wipe out the Babylonians. So, the Persians do to the Babylonians what the Babylonians did to the Assyrians, what the Assyrians did to everybody else. And it's a similar process where people, Persia was also famous for once they captured your area, they would deport your best and brightest, and they would want to sort of indoctrinate you into the Persian way, and kind of go from there. So that sort of is the MO for all these, world powers. What happens? That'd be an interesting study. Where they go from there, tracing that into different people, and I have no idea. I'm sure somebody did a study on that, but that's we have to talk to John on that one. He seems to have all the answers. So, yeah. So.
The language was called Akkadian.
Yeah. So that's that's what most people. That would be the common language that was spoken.
Of the Babylonians.
My book says the common language of Babylon was Aramaic, while the language of scholarship included the ancient and complicated Babylonian language. And that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. So Aramaic is just a commoner's language that showed up in a bunch of different places. So it's and part of this book is, this book is written in two different languages. Now we just get the English version, Daniel. So part of Daniel is written in Hebrew, and the other part is written, it's either in Aramaic or it might be, and it's not Akkadian, but it's written in something else. The parts that where it seems like it's coming from Babylonian literature, like when Nebuchadnezzar, he gives an account of some things, that's different than the Hebrew. But they would have, so if you're in the southern part of the U.S., you speak English and you speak Spanish, right? If you go to another part of the U.S., you're going to speak English and you're going to speak maybe something else. So, there might be some secondary languages that show up inside of the United States. Same thing here. They had an official language that, that would have been their writings, their official records, things like that. And then they would have had other dialects and languages that would have been spoken throughout the empire. Because this is a large area. And also keep in mind, they would be learning the Babylonian way, but it wasn't like it was prohibited not to speak your language. It's not like, they still it's sort of like just a conglomerate. They took a lot of that in. But as long as you lived in the Babylonian way, you had some level of a pass. Same things when the Romans take over and the Greeks. They have a predominant language, but there are other dialects that come with it.
As a child, I thought that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the three wise men.
Yeah. So yeah. Yeah.
I realize now that I've studied that they were very wise men. They just weren't.
Yeah, probably not the wise men, and Belshazzar, there's a name that's similar to that when the wise men, at least, we don't know who the wise men, we don't know their names, all right? So that's here we actually have it's listed. The wise men, the fact that it's, the only reason why we think there's at least three is because there's three gifts. It probably was a group of folks. You're looking at astrologers or what they, that's who they were. And it wasn't safe to travel a great distance with just three people on the back of a camel. So they were probably a number of them with their entourages and servants and things like that. We say three. That three gifts that looks good on our nativity sets. And the fact that and they're not even there at the nativity. All right, so they're there when Jesus is a little boy. So, just over time, we have a tendency to lump it all together in our traditions, but, that's not necessarily biblically the most accurate, is to assume that all three of those, and the donkey and the sheep and, and everything else was there. That's probably not what happened, But it doesn't, you can't buy your trinkets, so, there's a lot of things that we just assume, and over time, as part of our practices, and it's like organ, right? So most people think that the organ is the official language of the Bible. The official music or instrument of the Bible, and the organs. The reason why the organ was brought in at one point, the organ was very contemporary. in the 1500s, contemporary. And many of your hymns that you love are actually tied to indigenous, bar songs, for lack of better words, the tune. But what Christians were really good at is they would take something that would, it's a mode of evangelism. You take something that people already know, and you use that as a means by which to help them, to introduce Jesus. So Martin Luther was famous for this. He was one of the early ones that would take something that was either in Latin or something that was tied to the teaching or the tradition of the church. He would put it in dramatic language. And, part of it is to teach people, right? So you don't have the printing press until the mid-1500s. So that's even after Martin Luther. So all the education was tied to the university, which was tied often to the church, or unless you did like a law degree or something like that. So education was not for the public masses. And so that's why you have stained glass windows. It could kind of give you, anybody could look at a stained glass window and pick something out. And what Luther did is he wanted to, part of the whole push of his view with reform of the church is that everybody should have the gospel. Everybody should have the Bible. Everybody should have these things. Because for years, people were going to church and they still gave the mass or gave the service in Latin. Well, Latin was a dead language for ages. And so you just kind of sit there and for a while, and then you go take communion, and then you leave, and you pay you pay some alms to the poor, and then out the door, you went. And so Luther, wanted to change some of that. And so one of the ways he did is he put it into the language that everybody understood. Well, you can't just give it to them in like a 5-page document. They can't read. They're not educated. So you have to pick something that they know. Well, you pick, take me out to the ball game or something, and you put some Jesus into it, and all of a sudden they're humming that tune, and next thing you know, they're singing about the gospel. So, the Christians have been doing that for, December 25th, all right? So, and I preached on this one time, so you have to go back a while, but one of the things that came out of the Council of Nicaea, the church hasn't met for ages, and they're finally able to meet in 325. Well, they've got all these things, these questions, and so one of the things they did is they formalized it all, some of the traditions, and one of it is Christmas Day, December 25th. Whether or not Jesus was born on the 25th, who knows? That's like, we just don't know. He was probably born in the springtime more than anything else. But there was a pagan festival and that was used and tied to the sun god, and Christians said, there's a larger God than this, and well, sorry, that's all right. Don't argue with me. Argue with all the bishops from the Council of Nicaea. So, but it's not. But trust me, when I read this for the first time, I was like, "What?" And so I got my Bible out and looking, But the idea was not just to nail the day. That's really not what's most important. What's most important is to see everything in a society through the lens of Christ. And that's the purpose of it all. And so what the church does with time and space is to, what do we do with our time? What do we do with our space so that even that sits under the lordship of Christ? Well, if that's the case, then everything has to be parsed through, what your faith. And so they did that with every aspect of their society. Even the things that didn't originate or first originate from a Christian origin. But they, when you put Jesus into it, guess what? It becomes Christian. And so there you go. Sorry to bust your bubble. So you have 10 minutes to deal with it because we're going to take a break. So you can drown your sorrows for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and look at Daniel. Ooh, cake.
It's been rumored that Mighty Fortresses Our God was a beer drinking
It
song.
was. I know. Yeah, I know exactly. Yeah, that's more than rumored. Mary Pat, are those your cakes? Boy, those are good. Wow, really good. Hey, ma'am.
Did you say Ed Boon's funeral has been set up or
Has not.
has not?
We think it's going to be Friday morning, but we don't know for sure. Yeah. So we All righty, let's go ahead and come back so maybe we can get into and finish. Um, hopefully we can get to the end of the chapter. That would be nice. So we're going to move in now to what would be one of the first, either I'm going to call it a test, or at least some level of where Daniel and the three have to figure out what's their life going to look like inside of living in this new place. So if somebody would read for us verse 8 through 16, and we'll jump into this.
But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself as well. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. Daniel said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give them nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance of what the young men who eat the royal food treat your servants in accordance, and say what you say.
All right, good. So we get at least this. Did you notice that the sovereignty of God showing up? You know, Daniel describing how all this is playing out, all under God's hand. Where I think where he talked about, and God gave. And he's talking about the chief eunuch. something along the lines of gave him insight or gave them favor. So at least to begin to have some level of this test. In verse 8, you do have the word defile. That occurs 11 times in the Old Testament. And so it's a pretty strong word. And because it carries a lot of weight, that this is not just something that's tinsel or this is something that's heavy. And there are two reasons why Daniel is, or let me ask this: what might be the reasons why Daniel does not want to eat from the king's table? Yeah, so obviously he's or even larger than Daniel. Why might not religious Jews, or why might they be reluctant to eat from the king's food? All right, Pam, you were in first. What? Yeah, food restrictions. What were you going to say? Something? Yeah. So Leviticus chapter 11, I think, is all the food laws. And then it's also in Deuteronomy. It's maybe around 10 to 11 or 14, 15, somewhere in that neighborhood. But those are the chapters that outline or outlines what is considered kosher, or what can you eat and what you can't eat. And we think that this is a pretty good guess, that obviously this would have had some level of pork. It also would have had horse flesh in it. So there's obviously some meats that they wouldn't eat. And then, there is this idea that it's a restriction of the food law. And so if you think back to when the food laws were given, the Israelites were moving out of Egypt into Canaan that was already had inhabitants that lived a different way. And so the distinctive food laws was a way for them to maintain their sense of identity and their uniqueness, which was tied to God. So it's not just being restricted by what to eat, what not to eat. I mean, the food laws have to always be seen in comparison to where the Israelites were going. In this case, would be Canaan, and that would apply here. So you have what makes Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What makes them unique in Babylon? Well, that's just they're tied to Adonai. They're tied to Yahweh, and so being tied to God means that they live distinctively, they live differently, and in this case, it involves itself in some level of food. Now, this is not the only time something like this occurs in the Bible, or at least occurred with people who are tied to Old Testament, New Testament, because Paul dealt with the same thing in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And where you've got people in a Roman world and they don't know what to do if they're invited to a person's house and that person has a meal. Do you eat the food or do you don't eat the food? And of course, by the time of the New Testament, Paul's advice, or at least wording, is it doesn't matter what you eat or don't eat. That doesn't defile you per se. You need to pay attention to if it bothers somebody else who's a believer, then obviously you don't want to eat it. So the precept or the teaching changes a little bit by the time you get into the New Testament than say from the Old Testament. Should that matter? I mean, does it matter? Does it not matter? Go ahead. You're in. Yeah, so the next issue, but it's the same thing that applies with Paul. So one issue is that it was a violation of the food laws in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. The other issue is that the food probably was offered to some Babylonian god first, and a portion of that would have stayed either at that altar or whatever, and then it would have been distributed to everybody else. But the same thing applies in 1 Corinthians, because the context of what Paul is writing about is if you get invited to someone's house and maybe it's a graduation or a wedding or something like that, and you decide to go and they offer food that, one, is a violation of the food laws, or two, it's been offered to idols, which is really the context for Paul. What do you need to do? And Paul's advice is that, I mean, it goes to great length. You can read this in Corinthians, is that the food is just the food. It doesn't matter. And the idols, it's just wood or stone or whatever it may be. I mean, it sort of debunks this idea that the food is spiritual. He said, however, if there's somebody that says, oh yeah, this food was offered to an idol, we don't need to eat it, then Paul's teaching is you have freedom to eat whatever you want, but you use your freedom for the benefit of somebody else, that you build up the people, you build up the body, you build up another person. So don't eat it, not because the food is morally evil or good. Don't eat it because that what you do is a witness, and that could affect somebody. So it's a little different and by the time Paul comes. And some of that you can see, obviously, Christ. So you move into what Jesus did, and then how does that then interpret what you do going forward? Not unlike the Christmas discussion. Everything now is seen through the person Jesus and what Jesus has done for people, particularly access to God. But in this case, for Daniel, to eat the food that's a moral issue for Daniel, and so they didn't want to eat it. So the idea is, how do we come up with something without eating? Because they could have just thumbed their nose at it, but the odds are they probably would have been killed. I mean, because they would be rejecting the king's offer. When the eunuch even describes, after Daniel gives the proposition, what's his response? Oh, let me think about this. That's exactly right, because it's not just you're not eating the food, because if this ends up adversely affecting you, then that's on me, and I've then got to go to explain it to the king about, I let this happen. So it's not just, oh, he's going to, dock my wages. He actually uses a pretty interesting phrase. He'll take my head. So I mean, it's not just it's not a little thing that what they're asking, and but this isn't the only time where people, food issues or other issues where it becomes an aspect of their faith. What do they do? What levels of defilement will Daniel and his friends either be a part of or not be a part of? So they come up with this substitute diet, or at least this proposal. For 10 days, we're going to eat different foods, and then you judge for yourself which is better. Now, there are some people who like, and this is an interesting discussion. One of the questions that comes out of this is that Daniel's approach to this is fairly unique. I mean, he doesn't just kind of pound his fist on the table and say, I'm not eating it. I mean, it's sort of inviting the other person in to kind of process with him. Think about what Daniel did and his approach to dealing with either disagreement or whatever it may be, compared to what goes on today. Obviously, we've been well schooled in Daniel's approach, right, and how we talk to each other. It's we seem to be moving in the opposite direction. Whenever there's disagreement or something, it's we either cancel each other out. I think that's the proper words that are used now, but it's more of in your face than it is. Let me invite you in to see if we can come up with a possible solution, which I think is interesting. I think there's some wisdom here for us to. And you would imagine, at least I think you could make the case, that if Daniel is wrong, he would then eat the food from the king. Would he? You don't think so? Okay, that's fine. I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility. You judge for what? So what if the eunuch what if the eunuch came back and said, "Can't see any difference," or I think Daniel probably could make a case that it still works. What's it matter then? But what if he came back and said, they're in better shape than you are? And we don't know, right? So there's a little bit of speculation. Would have Daniel just said, I'm not going to do it? Maybe not, because later on, when the lion's den, he's told not to pray, and he does pray. The three are told not to bow. To bow, and they don't bow. So, there could be that he would have said, nah, we're done. And then the book of Daniel would only been one chapter, because they would have ended with that. It took them out back and cut their heads off. So or thrown them into furnace, or God would have acted and done something, unique. But at least the way he approaches the eunuch is different to some degree than what others might do. And I think that's interesting when it comes on just a side note for how do we communicate with each other, particularly when we might be on opposite sides of the table. And do we throw the gauntlet down, or do we maybe find a way to work out something together on the front end? But he does, so the food violation of the law could have been sacrificed, most likely would have been. And the reason why this was difficult for Daniel, or at least this is not just an easy decision, because this could have been seen as an insult to the king. I mean, this could have been directly, you don't accept what I'm offering you. On top of that, Daniel and the three, they're not the only ones in the program. So there could have been levels of peer pressure. They're in this new area in Babylon. They're 900 miles away from Judah. So on one level, if there's any hope of survival, go along to get along or whatever it may be. So this definitely could have jeopardized their advancement or even their next phase of life after the 3 years. The food was not bad. This would have been the best food available in that time, in that area. And again, 900 miles away, what's it matter? Nobody's going to know, right? He's not at home. And you could ask, at least some could, where was God in all this? Because I've just been deported. I mean, when you go through a period in your life where it's incredibly difficult and your life's been turned upside down, we never ask that question, right? Why did this happen? Or why me? So Daniel easily could have asked that question. We were obedient back in Judah, at least we were, maybe not everybody else. So why is this happening to me? Why didn't the bad people get deported? So there are multiple reasons why that Daniel could have looked the other way, or could have just said, you know what, I'm just going to hold my nose and do it and pray for forgiveness, right? So, but he doesn't, and they have a proposition, and the proposition is that let us try our way for 10 days, and then you judge, not us. You determine whether or not the proposition works. Verse 9, there's a unique word that says that Daniel and the three have favor. Does your version say favor? Does anybody have anything other than favor?
And sympathy.
Favor and sympathy, yeah. So there's two words there. The word, what's that?
Mine says favor and compassion.
Yeah, favor and compassion. The word for favor is the word hesed. And hesed is, I would argue, at least in the top 5 or 10 unique words in the Old Testament. Because some of you might know the psalm, the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. All of that is one word, the hesed of God. And hesed, it sort of encompasses love, favor, mercy, goodness. I mean, this is the best Hebrew word to describe God's never-ending care for His people, and so it's a unique word, and and the idea is that under God's hand, the eunuch favors Daniel and grants the request. And there is the word sympathy, that's compassion, tender feelings, things like that. And now what we don't know is this. We don't know exactly when this took place. Because Daniel is in Babylon for about 80 years. We know it's early because they're still in the 3-year period of time. And probably would be on the beginning of the 3-year period of time. So this would probably be within the first year of Daniel's captivity in Babylon. But there, at least on some form or fashion, the court official has some level of either respect or affection for the four. Though he feared the king, he still allows them the opportunity to prove if the proposition is going to work or if it doesn't. And so we know that they eat vegetables. They don't eat the meat. They don't drink the wine, and they and of course they're going to be tested in 10 days. So anything else from this passage that comes out, or maybe you have questions or comments before we move to the very end?
That question about where was God? God was with him the whole time.
Yeah, but
See it.
yeah. So I think that's easy for us to see that God was with him all the time. If my parents were killed and I were deported, and now one day I'm living in the palace or have high status in Judah, and then a year later I'm in the Babylonian, I'm a Babylonian clog in the wheel.
Right, he might not see it, but
Right.
God was with him the whole time. I mean, he was with him when the
Sure. So that brings up an interesting question. So I mean, we can argue, and I think it's fair. A lot of times you can't see that God's with you in the middle of it. All right. So you can't. You can. It just takes work. You have to reflect. I mean, because what most human nature. I'm talking about human nature. So human nature, in the middle of crisis, pings. That's Shane's term. I mean, you're just the situation is determined so much about what you do, what you think, how you act. So one of the disciplines of reflection and some of the other spiritual disciplines is to slow the life down, regardless of the situation, so that you can see the work of God even in the midst of struggle, pain, or suffering. And maybe Daniel did this, maybe he didn't. We don't know. We do know that Daniel is a spiritually disciplined person. We don't know it now. We'll know it, I think, in chapter 7. But we do know to some degree that Daniel is a faithful person. So, he's writing this later in his life. He's not writing it like day one of year one. But, maybe Daniel did know, but I think it's a good question to ask that because there would be a number of folks, even biblical people that we study, that have asked the question, where are you in all of this? Because it doesn't seem like you're here. I mean, a quick read in the Psalms, you get that. And these were written by people who were very faithful. So it's interesting. This is just one of the possibilities of why this decision was difficult. It's been my experience that you can see God in the middle of this, but my experience as a pastor, this takes work. Because most of us, when we're in the valley, or we're walking through what we would call the valley of the shadow of death, the environment or the situation can be so dire that it's all-consuming. Fair? All right. So what you have to do is you have to then move off your situation and focus on something else, which is hard to do. I'll be the first to admit. But it can happen.
God is in how these 10,000 people were taken to Babylon. The story was for them, but it was also for the generations that followed them.
Yes.
To be able to say, oh yeah, I'm in a bad place, but remember
Right.
Daniel was in a bad place.
Yeah.
So that we, them, and in their time, but still us in our time, can look at this story.
Correct. So the question that the statement she's making has to do with purpose of writing. Was Daniel writing for himself, or was this for something future generations and a reminder of the sovereignty of God, a reminder of God's graciousness in the middle of a foreign land and things of that nature. And I would lean a little bit more to the latter than I would be for the former. But that still takes, so if you give me a call tomorrow and you say, guess what, I'm in Babylon, and I just had my first seminar in the Babylonian way, and I'm going to be here for 3 years, and it's just all dire. What we could say is, buck up, shellac some Jesus on it, and go on about your stuff. Right? We could. Yeah, exactly right. Something, because we do that. We love Christian cliches, and that probably has more to do with the person speaking and their discomfort with anxiety around the situation than really anything else. But there's, it still might be true. It just might not hit the mark.
What I'm saying is where anybody knew it or not, God was there with them.
From 2022, I would agree with that. From day one in Babylon, maybe not. We can assume that that's taking place, that Daniel, that is exactly what he believes. And there's some evidence of this. One, he's not going to defile himself. Later on, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will not bow down when the music's playing. Chapter 7, Daniel still is going to pray, even if he's told not to. So, I would agree with that. At the same time, what I would argue is that there are many people who find themselves in a situation similar, and they're looking for ways that God is with them, but for some, getting there takes a process. It takes a while. Yeah. So, sure. Yeah. And that's it is hard. That's one of the things that as followers of God, we have to constantly remind ourselves that whether it be the mountaintop or the valley, doesn't change God's care and love and God's presence in our life. What we're not spared is the walk. And I think that's where a number of people inside the church, that sometimes that can be a struggle, because fair or unfair, we do it sometimes carrying an assumption that thinks that because we are a follower of God, whether or not we admit it or not, we do expect for the wheels to be greased.
Yeah, but Jesus told his disciples that it's not going to be easy.
No, I totally agree with you.
It's not easy for us.
Right, but in the middle of it, I'm not saying that God's not, all right? So I'm a firm believer in that. All I'm saying is that in the middle of it, it is not that easy. Yeah. So part of the discipline that we prepare ourselves for in thick and thin is that regardless if the wind is in our face or if the wind is at our back, we want to work to see God everywhere. But you lose a loved one, and you go over and say, 2 days after someone's died, and you say, God's going to be with you. Yeah, mentally that's true, and mentally we might get that, but on the heart level, there's a little bit of a disconnect.
The orphans in Ukraine,
Yeah, same thing. So, that one of the things they could say is, which has already been a struggle in their life, especially a struggle in their life compared to ours. All right, so we have to be mindful of that. And then they could ask, why? And they could see the evidence of God's care going on, and be like Daniel in the middle of it. My argument is just that it's not as easy just to say God is with you. It doesn't change whether or not I say it or whether or not someone understands it. It doesn't change whether or not it's true. I'm just saying when you go from here to here, that's a process. All right? So that's the work of faith maturation. That's the work of faith development. that where we count on, and the best times of growth, they come from suffering. Right? Which is what Americans hate to hear. We have zero theology of suffering. We do. I mean, so compared to other parts of the world. And I mean, there's a whole theology of suffering that, we don't preach on, we don't teach on it, we don't like it. But if you go to other areas of the world and, the parts of the Bible they focus on, I mean, I can tell you they're going to be on the suffering parts because that's more of their life than it would be for us. I mean, it's the same thing when we talk about persecution inside the United States. There is no persecution. There's just stuff you don't like. But your job's not being taken away. Your house is not being taken away. You didn't have to hide to come to church today to study for fear of your life being, destroyed or being put to death. I mean, we don't have persecution. We just have what we don't like. But, now you go to other parts of the world, it really is persecution, which means that if you publicly do something that is, in the name of God, you could be killed, or your house and your assets could be taken, or so that's persecution. It's not persecution for us. We just have discomforts, which is okay. I'm not beating up on anybody. I mean, I don't want, there's some things I don't like, but I'm just saying to frame that in something where we want to take our life and say it's exactly like this person's life, well, that's not true. I mean, we don't like to admit it, but it's not. I mean, but we don't, it's fairly easy to be a Christian in the United States. I mean, you're going to pass, count this week how many billboards, signs, churches, that you see just in your daily, weekly life. I bet it's over 100, at least. They're everywhere. I mean, on TV, social media, even when we want to say, well, God is, Jesus drips all over the place here. And, it's what we don't like is it's just not what we want 100%, or somebody might take a different stance than ours. And human nature, particularly American human nature, is to say people are against us. All right? I mean, you go outside and talk to other people who grow up in different countries, Christians who grow up in different countries, that they're going to have a totally different take on it. Don't feel bad. Don't feel. I mean, look at your face like forlorn now. Everybody's like, "Oh no. Don't. It's just a statement of what is. So don't walk away feeling guilty or anything like that. It's just, it's just part of how we operate. It's just not the same as it would be in other areas or particularly in other time periods. But there's, it's not persecution in the traditional sense here. It's just that things we're a little discomfort, we don't like it, or they don't take exactly, they don't believe exactly what we believe. But, even that, 95% of all Protestant denominations, and even you can put the Catholic side of the house in that as well, they're all the same. I mean, they disagree on a few things, but 95% of it is all the same. And the fact that what I hope, what I think revival will be inside of the world is when Christians start fighting amongst themselves, as if to say who's the holy ones and who are not. Because when you look at the church's history, that's really not the issue when it comes to revival. They don't see it as us and them, as in fighting among family members. It's us, and be careful with it. I want to be careful with that language, but it's all of us who are under Christ and trying to make the world look like God's kingdom. That's normally when revival comes. And it comes sometimes at the hands of denominations or sides of the house that you wouldn't think, but it still does. So, anyway, I'm off it. Let's get to the very end. I got 2 minutes. I got to finish chapter 1. Verse 17, as for these 4 youth, God gave them learning and skills and all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them now was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So this King Cyrus is, that's at the end. So you give an idea, you get a summary statement about how long Daniel's going to be in Babylon. So you have, at the end of chapter 1, what Daniel is describing is that after this 3-year period of time, that they found themselves in preferred over the others. Now, the reason why this is important is because this also comes on the heels after this. So you got this idea that their stance, their faith, if you want to use the word rewarded, was blessed, things of that nature, then there's some, I think you could draw that conclusion. You have mentioned magicians, enchanters. Magicians are not like what we think when it comes to magicians today. Magicians probably in this world would be like scribes, writers, keepers of what's going on. Now the enchanters would be more like what we would think would be a magician. But just a little insight there. The magicians would be the ones that were in touch with, obviously the stars and things like that, but the idea was not like casting spells or something like that. That's more in line with the enchanters. So just to kind of give you some insight there on those. The way we end in chapter 1, Daniel's probably about 85, 90 years old, roughly, because he would have been in 70 plus years in Babylon. So he was there throughout the entire time from the exile all the way through the reign of Cyrus, so he would have witnessed all of that. So one of the questions that I don't have time to answer, but one of the questions that we don't have time to answer, one I want you to think about is, this is often a chapter that is used to talk about how should we engage the culture around us. Should we participate in it? Should we sort of be against it and be removed from it? Should we be knee-deep in it? There's just something for us to think about. Because what we'll see is that Daniel is in it to some degree at times, and then there's times where he takes a stance against it. So it's just it's interesting to see how we should be how we should interact with the world around us, and Daniel's a pretty good example to sort of look at that. All right, questions, comments, concerns? We all ready? Good. All right, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.